Hi, Concordia University, Irvine. I'm Elizabeth Drury, and I was so happy to be out on your campus on May the 9th to lead a lunch session about intercultural competency as part of the HSI Learning Series. I was welcomed warmly by Erica Sanchez, your director, and by my longtime colleague, Dr. Fuyi Schuler. Your whole community has been welcoming to me, and your campus is beautiful, and I loved being there. Thank you so much for the invitation. You might notice that the title of this session is maybe a little surprising. Intercultural Competency, Why Bother? You are a Hispanic serving institution. You're leaning into that. And so maybe this question, why bother, sounds a little irreverent. So I guess I just want to tell you ahead of time, this session is not going to be 25 rules, tips, and tricks for succeeding interculturally. I hope you have 25 rules, tips, and tricks for doing that. And that's a topic I'd love to talk about another time. But before that, there's one topic that I think is far more important and far more foundational. And that is settling this question of why bother. Now, maybe the answer seems obvious to you, but I've been doing this for many years, and I've discovered that most people haven't taken that question deep enough. So that's really what we're going to do today. And so I hope you enjoy it. I would love to hear your feedback. Here's my contact information. I blog at vibrancy.blog, and what I am thinking about and processing there is how do we live out holiness in the wonderful diversity of the modern world. So if you are interested in that and want to contribute your thoughts and see what I'm thinking, it often has to do about culture, but it has to do with other topics as well. So check that out and let me hear from you. Comments, questions, and feedback help me to be better. So I would really appreciate it. Again, thank you so much for the invitation. It's an honor to be part of what you're doing, and enjoy. Well, let's dive right in. Here are some pictures of my family. My husband and I have been married over 30 years, and we've lived and raised our children in some very diverse places with a wonderful variety of people. We've been in Southern California, we've been in the DC area, and we've been part of churches and other groups that were very diverse. And I love diversity, and I am energized in intercultural environments and organizations. I love travel, language learning, food. I love intercultural relationships and teams and worshiping together. I love the broadened perspective that I gain in those experiences. Now, I know that not everyone is naturally attracted to all things intercultural, but I love to work with Christian organizations and churches to promote intercultural joy anyway, because we are people on mission, advancing God's purposes in this world. That's what we're supposed to be about. But I can't count how often I encounter good people with good intentions that fail or that just never go anywhere. And because I'm working with people who love Jesus and who are committed to what He desires, I've had to ask why. Why is it that their good intentions fail? Why is it that they can start well and be full of enthusiasm and attend various trainings and have genuine desire to accomplish something interculturally? They and their organizations can start entire initiatives and spend a lot of time and money developing them. But yet, they encounter difficulty just like we all do, or maybe insult or pushback, perhaps from within their own cultural home base, and they tap out. All of that motivation does not have sustainability. Why not? Why does this happen? Why do good people fail? You can fail, and I can fail. Motivation is fickle, and that's a fact. Now, we're going to come back to that. And this is not going to be a downer of a session, I promise. So put a bookmark on that, and let's shift gears for just a moment. I want to do a verse exercise with you. I love to memorize scripture, and I have some quirky ways of doing it that work for me. So I'm going to do that with you, but I want you to take a look at this passage first. Just get the whole passage and take it in. Proverbs 4, verses 23 through 26, and I'm reading from NIV. Above all else, guard your heart, for everything you do flows from it. Keep your mouth free of perversity. Keep corrupt talk far from your lips. Let your eyes look straight ahead. Fix your gaze directly before you. Give careful thought to the paths for your feet, and be steadfast in all your ways. Now, if you attended the live session, you know that we had a little fun with memorizing this verse. For the video, we're going to go old school. And so when each of the following screens appears, Pause your video and see if you can fill in all of the blanks before checking your answers on the next screen. Okay, so why did I do this verse exercise? Take a look at this verse again. God tells us here to live thoughtfully. He wants us to guard our hearts, our behavior. That would include speech and interactions, for example. He wants us to guard our focus. Look at this verse here that mentions our eyes. He wants us to guard our will. He wants us to think about these things. Where are our feet going? He says, give careful thought to these things. This is an introspective, self-critical, self-correcting life that we live as Christians. Why? Because God wants us to be purposeful. There are some things that are very important to Him, and those include living well and flourishing and honoring Him and loving others and being on mission with Him in this world. So in light of the reality that good people with good intentions can fail, we should probably give careful thought to our ways in this area. So the goal today is to help you to be purposeful, to guard your heart and your feet, to be steadfast in all your ways. And this is a very personal and individual process. This is not a one-size-fits-all endeavor. So how do we do that? Well, often trainings like this, I think, aim too low. Like, let's just help people get along with each other. They can grit their teeth and bear it. We want to prevent intercultural problems. But the fact is we shouldn't be aiming low because we serve God. We believe that His Holy Spirit works within us. We believe that He can do all things. He does impossible things. So our aspiration in this kind of emphasis should be far higher than just getting by. It should be flourishing, which is what all of us really hope for anyway. And that's kind of success and joy in the intercultural endeavor is what I think of as flourishing interculturally. The other thing that trainings like this often do is that whereas they aim too low, I think, they also often assume too much. And that kind of gets back to what I was saying about it not being a one-size-fits-all process. Where you want to go with your intercultural competency and what it takes to get there are highly individualized and very, very personal. So ultimately, long-term, more than avoiding failure, I want you to have sustainable effectiveness and joy in navigating diversity well. I want you to do a thought experiment with me. Think back to your childhood, or to any other time in life if you prefer, and imagine a skill that you had every opportunity to develop, but you didn't. And now that the opportunity is past, you regret it, and you can see how it would be useful to you in your life today. Why didn't you develop it back then? And then after those questions, turn your attention to a skill that you have chosen to develop and consider why. For me, the neglected opportunity would be to learn to play the piano. My grandmother was a concert pianist. We had a piano in our home. She was a professor of music. She was someone for whom record albums were made and sold. She tried to teach me. My parents had me in lessons all the time, and I didn't run with it. How I regret that now. I see so many opportunities when being able to play the piano would be helpful. And I love music, but I merely play with the piano, which is quite a far cry from playing the piano. What about you? Pause the recording and think about it for a minute. When I asked this question to a session with the faculty and staff, and then later when I asked them about skills that they did choose to learn and develop, I heard some great responses. Everyone had discussed these questions in pairs. And afterwards I asked who had heard something from their partner that sounded really important, something that was clearly very meaningful to that person. Now, in the few short minutes that we had, not everyone had something really profound right on the tip of their tongue, but some people did. And the group identified 2 people who had said something that was clearly really meaningful to them. If I remember correctly, and maybe I have my facts mixed up, one of them said that he wished that he had learned history better when he'd had the opportunity growing up, and the other one said that she wished that she would have studied psychology as an undergrad. Now, I started prodding those two and asking them deeper and deeper layers of why. I probably actually annoyed them a little bit with my questioning until they realized where I was going with it. I started with the history person. So why do you wish you would have learned history better back then? He sort of laughed and said, I think it would help me to do my job better today. So I asked, and why do you think it would be good to do your job better today? And amused, he said, so I can make a living? And everyone sort of laughed. And then I said, but why is it important that you make a living? And then it got a little more serious, and he said, so I can take care of my family. And why do you think it's important to take care of your family? And he said, because I love them. And then I prodded even more. Why do you think it's important to take care of the people that you love? And he was starting to feel a little exasperated by this point, I think, and he was grasping for words a bit, until he said decisively, because God has given me that responsibility, and he expects me to do it. We could all tell that he really meant it. And that was exactly the answer that I'd hoped for. So I turned to the other person. Why do you wish you would have studied psychology as an undergrad? I asked. Well, because it would have helped me to become a therapist sooner. So I asked, and why did it matter for you to become a therapist sooner? And she said, because there are people out there who need a therapist. So why do you think that that's you? And why did the timing matter? And she said, because I know what resources are out there, and I know what resources are lacking, and I know that I have something unique and better to offer in helping them. And I said, but why are you on the hook? Just because you see that you can help, why do you feel that you should or must help? Because those people are loved by God, she said, and I'm supposed to care about what he cares about and who he cares about to the very best of my ability. And those two responses were kind of like mic drop moments. Both of them exemplify a very important principle. Our skills need purpose. Just like any set of tools sitting in your garage and collecting dust, skills can be close at hand. You might already even have them, but that doesn't mean that you're actually going to use them, especially when you consider how many inducements there are in life not to use them. Think of all those skills that you didn't develop when you had the chance. Maybe you had too many distractions in your life, other interests, fear, a feeling of inadequacy, discouragement. Maybe someone insulted you. Maybe it was just inconvenient in your life. Had you had a compelling purpose, you might have done it. And for many of you, once you discovered that purpose later in life, you went all in developing the needed skills. Now, some people might say that this is simply motivation, but I don't think so. As I said before, motivation is fickle, and motivation can fail. But purpose is different. And I want to tell you a research story that illustrates that point. It's my own research story, actually, and I'll need to give you a little background information first. The first piece of that information has to do with the idea of culture itself, and how I define that term, and how it relates to my work. Here's a brief excerpt from my video series about the relationship between culture and our spiritual lives, which you can find on the Vibrancy blog if you'd like to see more. This is how I teach about culture. This is the essence of culture. This is how things work inside group borders. Remember, inside the circle, we share a range of preferences and means of control. For the most part, we know what to expect. Who are our people? What do we like? How do we go about getting it? How do we respond when we don't? There's reassurance and a sense of safety in that kind of predictability. Outside the circle, this is not so. We don't know who those people are, or what they like, or what their rules are. It's unpredictable. It feels a little risky, even dangerous. We're pretty sure things will be different out there, and we might not have things the way we like them. We might not get our way. Out there in the Wild West, people look at life differently than we do. It's uncomfortable. If we let those people into our circles, we sort of intuit that it could be uncomfortable too. What if they come in and bring their wild, unpredictable ways? So to focus our culture conversation, I call venturing from the inside of our familiar circles to the outside border crossing. Crossing that boundary can also happen from the other direction, letting people in, which we could think of as hospitality or making room or welcoming the stranger. And this border around us, which can be hard to cross in either direction by going out or by welcoming people in, it can be anything. Ethnicity, culture, politics, religion, generation, doctrine, denomination, and on and on and on. We seem to be able to find plenty of reasons to divide ourselves off from other people, to define our group as something different from their group. Now that's a pretty human tendency. So as you can see, when I'm talking about culture and cultural differences, yes, I do mean international cultures, but the same principles often apply to differences between groups right here at home. And this is the second bit of background information that I'd like to give you. Some of you may recognize these categories. These are the 4 domains of cultural intelligence, often called CQ for short. David Livermore is an author who has popularized cultural intelligence, which was first articulated by P. Christopher Early and Sun Ang in 2003. What I expected to find in the responses of my participants was evidence of these 4 domains. What are they? First, cognition. This is knowledge. Plain and simple. Do you seek knowledge of the cultures that you're encountering? Language, history, geography, all of that. Second, metacognition. This is not knowledge itself. This is how you make sense of your knowledge, how you think about what you know about culture, how you organize your knowledge, plan for more, evaluate your knowledge of another culture or of cultures in general. Livermore has called metacognition interpretive CQ or CQ strategy. Third, there's motivation, and that's pretty self-explanatory. Within that, we have intrinsic motivation, which is like enjoying something. Do you seem to have a natural interest and desire to learn more about culture? That's intrinsic motivation. There's also extrinsic motivation, which has to do with external factors that drive you to engage interculturally, like a job overseas or a grade for a culture class, for example. Livermore has called motivation perseverance CQ and CQ drive. And finally, we have behavior. And behavior is how we sort of live out what we know. Livermore refers to it as behavioral CQ or CQ action. Whenever I talk about skill, I'm talking about the CQ model, because these 4 domains together reflect your intercultural skill. Now at last, let's talk about the research story. From 2012 to 2014, I conducted a study to understand how students at a Christian university navigate unfamiliar people, ideas, and situations. In the course of my research, I elicited data in many ways. I observed participants in a weekend inner-city immersion experience in which many of them felt extremely uncomfortable. They slept outside in sleeping bags near Skid Row in Los Angeles, for example, and served breakfast at a homeless shelter. Later, I assigned them a controversial book about race to read, and I conducted a focus group discussion about it. I also asked the participants to write personal reflections about these experiences and exercises. Finally, I interviewed each of them privately and asked them to tell me about the most stretching cross-cultural experiences of their lives. After all of these activities, I followed a well-known approach in qualitative research, a grounded theory approach, to try to understand how they process these unfamiliar experiences and ideas. I combed through every word they had written or spoken, looking for patterns. Consider, for example, a statement like this from one of the participants. He said, "I was so afraid to go, but once I got over the initial shock, I had so much fun. My host family really took care of me. They showed me all the sights and introduced me to so many people. I felt so loved." As I worked through the participant statements, I labeled every distinct chunk of meaning with a code or name. I started with all kinds of codes, hundreds of them. For example, in a statement like this one, here are some of the chunks I might have coded. The next step was to categorize all of those codes into larger and larger ideas, constantly going back and forth through the data to be sure that I was coding and grouping them accurately as true reflections of what the person really meant. So, for example, sightseeing, meeting new people, and fun might have ended up in the same broad category, like this, and the entire statement might also have been coded as a positive experience. And a positive experience might have been included in an even bigger category of intrinsic motivation. This is the basic operating procedure of grounded theory research. As I was working, I attempted to follow the grounded theory principle of letting the data speak for itself. That is, instead of determining categories ahead of time, I would just wait and see which broad groupings would become obvious or necessary to organize and describe the data. That's what I had planned to do. I had expected to see the 4 domains of cultural intelligence emerging at the broadest levels, and I did. The knowledge CQ domain showed up clearly, no problem with that. The CQ action or behavior domain was pretty clear too, even though that was not formally observed in my study. Plenty of evidence emerged for the domains of CQ drive or motivation and CQ strategy or metacognition, but these 2 categories had huge problems. These weren't supposed to be overlapping. Now, I'd made a mistake in my grounded theory approach, but I hadn't realized it yet. So I really wrestled with examples like this. I just feel that to be the person I was created to be, I need to learn from people from other cultures. To be willing to see life from diverse perspectives, I have to cultivate humility. My challenge is figuring out ways to keep myself from getting comfortable in my own bubble so that I remain open. Will I ever serve people in the inner city again? Will I still want to? Will I have the kind of habits and relationships in my life 10 years from now so that I'll still be hearing their perspective? Will I care? I hope so. Now, how would you code a statement like that? How would you decide whether certain words and phrases reflect motivation or strategic thinking? I think you'd find that many of them are both. If you find this example difficult, then you're getting a feel for my dilemma. This young man exhibits motivation for sure, no question about that. He wants to be open to unfamiliar people, but he also exhibits strategy, doesn't he, as he tries to figure out how he will maintain his motivation to be open over time. But is strategizing regarding future motivation better coded as strategy or motivation? Furthermore, the young man expresses both motivation and strategy within the overarching framework of who he believes he was created to be. How does that element get coded or categorized? That difficulty is what got my attention, and all of a sudden I realized my error. By its very nature, grounded theory does not try to squeeze data into pre-selected categories. That I had been making this mistake, forcing the data to conform to the pre-existing categories of cultural intelligence theory. Instead, grounded theory tries to name each unique bit of data accurately on its own merits. I realized that I needed to stop, retrace my steps, and redo all of my coding from the very beginning. It was a very time-consuming process, but it led to a breakthrough. What I found was a surprise. Because of numerous examples, I realized that something more than cultural intelligence was at play, something that came up over and over again, something I heard in the stories and reflections of every participant, and I called it concern. It was an underlying sense of I should or I ought to that either propelled them to venture outside their zones of comfort and familiarity or that kept them close to home base. It wasn't motivation exactly, and it wasn't strategy exactly either. It was something different. Every participant in my research had concern of some type, expressed as sort of a life calling or orientation. Which type of concern do you think contributes to sustainability in intercultural competency? It's obvious, right? Border crossing concern. What I found is that CQ skill and border crossing concern worked together. There's an interplay between them. And the people that showed the greatest promise of long-term success interculturally or sticking with it long-term and growing and developing are people who had both high CQ skill and high concern. They expressed an internal value or conviction about the rightness of crossing borders, and they also evidenced high CQ. You can see them up here in this top quadrant. Let me interject a word about my process. To avoid revealing identities and personal information, I referred to participants only with nicknames when I reported my findings. The best example of this type of participant I nicknamed the journalist, because he regularly sought out varied viewpoints on campus about divisive issues. He read and listened to grow his knowledge of different groups' perspectives. He described to me his own personal strategies for stretching his learning, and he excitedly described group discussions that he had planned to help people get to the bottom of a matter together and to understand each other. And I could clearly see and hear that he had an adaptive, communicative style. In these ways, he reflected strength in all 4 domains of CQ. On top of that skill, he was resolute about the necessity of learning from other people and seeking to understand them as an aspect of what it means to be fully human. So he also reflected border-crossing concern. In contrast, I had some that had low skill and low concern. One in particular seemed very poorly able to interact across uncomfortable borders, suggesting low CQ, and he also showed a life orientation or concern towards staying close to the familiarity of home, interpersonally and ideologically. People and ideas outside of his familiar zone were neither very interesting nor very important to him, and in fact, they were a bit threatening. I nicknamed him the Freshman because his most significant border crossing experience was going to college. He did not want to eat with the other students in the cafeteria or to get to know them in the dorm. These people from different denominational backgrounds seemed strange to him and even dangerous, and I was sad when he told me that he was planning to move off campus the next year to live with his grandparents. Then I had some that had high skill and low concern. You see them up here in the left quadrant. These seem to have the skill to cross cultures and the motivation to succeed in specific, defined cross-cultural tasks, but they lacked the conviction to seek out new opportunities or to apply themselves to anything more than transactional cross-cultural relationships. For example, one young woman recalled a few interesting experiences with people and ideas outside her familiar culture, which was a tightly knit immigrant group, and she recounted times that she had needed to interact cross-culturally for particular objectives. I nicknamed her the politician because she had been active as an elected student leader and was very skillful in understanding and communicating with diverse people. However, her identity was firmly rooted within her community, and she did not foresee that outsiders would be especially important to her life in the grand scheme of things, or that they were very interesting. Even though she had high skill, she was very unlikely ever to put it to much use. And then finally, some had low skill but high concern. These were encouraging because even though they spoke of blunders and difficulties in their current cross-cultural relationships, their deep convictions would keep them working on building CQ skill for the long term. I nicknamed one of them the short-termer. This young woman recounted stories of going on short-term mission trips with tearful emotion and care, explaining that she believed God had called her to missions work in the future. Over and over again, she cited scripture to explain her deep commitment to intercultural learning and relationships, even as she also told me some stories about her interactions with her overseas hosts that had sort of made me cringe. She definitely needed to grow in intercultural skill, but I had absolutely no doubt that she would. These discoveries helped me to recognize that in order to sustain cultural effectiveness over the long term, people need both CQ skill and border crossing concern. Now, in some ways, concern sounds a lot like motivation. After all, both are reasons to do something. But it's important to recognize how concern is different from motivation. People can have one without the other. On one hand, they can utterly lack drive for a particular cross-cultural experience, perhaps through difficulty that arises, but they can nevertheless anchor a commitment to renew their motivation on a deeper sense of purpose that guides their lives. They can say, I don't want to do this, showing their low motivation, but I must, which shows their high concern. On the flip side, they could excitedly plunge into a cross-cultural encounter with intrinsic or extrinsic motives, but without having a deeper sense of purpose. When difficulties arise and they find themselves asking, why bother? They don't have a good answer for it, and they tap out. If you think about it, concern must be something outside of cultural intelligence, because it actively affects every domain of CQ, including the domain of motivation. It justifies attending to knowledge, strategy, motivation, and behavior, especially when doing so requires self-subordination or personal sacrifices. Finally, concern is more a meta-commitment than a motivation. The prefix meta means over and including comprehensively, so a meta-commitment is a commitment to be committed. It's an active inner working of strategy and motivation, two separate domains of CQ, to preserve the commitment over time. I would venture to guess that we all sort of know that our own motivation for crossing borders well is not reliable. It comes and goes. When everything is going great and we're getting rewarded or affirmed through the process, we love it. Honeymoons are wonderful. But as we share life with people across social and cultural borders, we have to prepare ourselves for the times when our motivation is fragile. People who see life differently than we do can refuse to do what we think is best. We can hurt each other or confuse each other or insult each other without meaning to. We can make one another's processes of getting things done within an organization much more complicated. We can decide that life would be more straightforward, conflict-free, and relaxed if we just stay in our own narrow zones of comfort and familiarity and do things our way with people like us. Motivation can betray our deepest commitments. It is fickle. Our depths of life, on the other hand, are not. Now take a look at these two. Meet Clovis and Velma here. When I see happy older couples who've been married for 50 or 60 years, I think, oh, I want that. Maybe you felt that way. Now, when these two decided to get married, they were very motivated to have a strong and satisfying relationship. They had intrinsic and extrinsic motives, and not surprisingly, their extrinsic motives were far less glamorous and compelling than the intrinsic ones. Their extrinsic motives included things like being able to save money, share effort, file joint income taxes, and other super romantic things like that. Their higher extrinsic motives may have been to please their parents, to spend more time together, to enjoy intimacy, and to have children someday. Their intrinsic motivation, in a nutshell, was simply that they were absolutely crazy about each other. They genuinely loved each other and the idea of being united for life. That intrinsic motivation supplied a lot of fuel for success. No doubt about it, they were very, very motivated. They had a honeymoon a long time ago, and it was awesome. And I don't know what's happening in this picture. Maybe they're watching the evening news or just saw something they didn't like on the Facebook. Maybe they've just had a squabble. But I love this picture because the reality of a marriage that lasts for 60 years, even the most satisfying marriages, is that there are lots of triggers along the way that could wreck their commitment and their enjoyment of one another. There are so many reasons that there could be failure. But Clovis and Velma decided a long time ago that they were going to have a meta-commitment in their marriage. They probably didn't use that word, and frankly, if they did, I'd like to meet them. But they had the right idea. They recognized at the very start that their motivation would ebb and flow over the years, and they decided that they wanted to do all that they could to safeguard this marriage, not just because they liked it, nor even because they loved each other, but because of a deeper life commitment to obey and honor the Lord. Their commitment to marriage was not just a commitment to marriage. It was a commitment to God, who wanted them to safeguard their marriage. So as part of that deeper commitment to God, they had rules that they set in place, like not going out with someone of the opposite sex, not leaving, not keeping secrets from each other, fighting fair, not harboring unforgiveness from one another, all kinds of things. Just like crossing cultures well, having a lifelong good marriage requires skill, of course, but all the skill in the world will be of no use without a deep commitment that can withstand disappointments and boredom and setbacks. Why should they bother loving each other well when they don't feel like it? And the same is true of your intercultural commitment. Deep down, do you know why you should bother to stay motivated over time? What's your higher commitment that governs that? Do you just want this particular effort to succeed, or is there some reason that you believe you should put your whole heart into it? We have thus seen that concern is far more than motivation. It's the very purpose for it. Border crossing concern, then, is a long-term meta-commitment rooted in the foundations of life that tells you why you should be motivated to cross borders skillfully in ways that change you. As we conclude, let's review. Motivation and skills training are not enough. We need both cultural intelligence skill and border crossing concern for our intercultural efforts to be sustainable. What about you? What are your bedrock commitments? How do your intercultural efforts connect to them? How sustainable is your commitment? Will it stand up to difficulties, discouragement, or opposition? What could kill your motivation? How do your deeper commitments answer those threats? And why does it all matter to you personally anyway? Why bother? I hope you'll take the time to answer these questions, maybe even writing them down. Articulating them to yourself can make a permanent difference that can benefit you and your intercultural relationships for the rest of your life. Imagine your campus, church, or organization as a diverse community in which everyone can flourish. Imagine yourself shaping that community. And imagine that you benefit from that community in unexpected and wonderful ways, missionally, spiritually, and personally. The skill that you need to do that is like that set of tools in your garage. Will you use it?
So dig down deep to connect your border crossing endeavors with the most meaningful and foundational principles of your life. Give careful thought to the paths of your feet, guard your heart, and be steadfast in all your intercultural ways.